We are live. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, folks. My name is Jason Loewith. I'm the Artistic Director of Only Theater Center. For those of you outside the DMV, Only is an award-winning professional regional theater in Maryland, just over the Washington, D.C. line, producing a diverse range of plays and musicals year-round on our 3-theater, 14-acre campus. We started our streaming Saturday program early on as a response to the pandemic, when we gathered local artistic directors to talk about what theater after the crisis would look like. The response and viewership was so strong, we decided to create it as a series running through June with a variety of artists and thought leaders to tell us what post-pandemic theater will be. And we decided to name it Artists Envision the Future. You can check out the full program on our website, www.onlytheater.org. Though we've gathered some more general panels by discipline, today's conversation is specific to a project that's near and dear to my heart. It's a project we've been planning for some time and which, in the light of the pandemic, has attained an even deeper level of meaning. It's a production of Meredith Willson's classic, The Music Man, but reimagined for a company and creative team evenly split among deaf and hearing artists. The show bows in spring 2021 at OTC, and we're hoping to see it in Oklahoma City soon after that. We'll be speaking today with five of the primary creative artists involved in the production, and I am proud to briefly introduce them alphabetically. Though co-director Michael Barron now lives in Oklahoma City, where he's artistic director of the Lyric Theater of Oklahoma City, he's got a long and illustrious track record here in the DMV. He's directed dozens of shows around town, most prominently at Signature Theater, where he was associate artistic director, but just as significantly at Adventure Theater, where he directed the world premiere of a musical I wrote with Chrissie Astre, Big Nate. Yes. He's worked with actress Sandra Mae Frank at Lyric and productions of Fiddler and Fun Home. And if you've seen Ford's Christmas Carol, you've seen his work. Read the titles of the other 90 shows he's directed at lyrictheaterokc.com. Joey Caverly is the main reason we're gathered here today, since this project was his brainchild, a versatile actor, director, and director of American Sign Language, or Dazzle. Joey earned a Helen Hayes Award nomination for his portrayal of Billy in Studio Theater's production of Tribes, a role he has played multiple times in major theaters across the country. He was a full-time member of OTC's production staff for many years, most of which he spent asking me whether I decided about doing The Music Man, until we lost him to Broadway, where he understudied the recent revival of Children of a Lesser God. He will be playing Marcellus in our production next spring. Check him out at joeycaverly.com. Sandra Mae Frank is also no stranger to Broadway. She played Wendla in Deaf West's groundbreaking staging of the musical Spring Awakening there in 2015. She's been pioneering roles traditionally played by hearing actors at major theaters across the country: Emily Webb in Our Town at Pasadena Playhouse, Joan in Fun Home, and Hoddle in Fiddler at Lyric, among others. In between theater, television, and film, she's busy as an artivist, advocating for deaf actors in the performing arts. Check her out at www.sandramayefrank.com. Co-director Alexandria Wailes, as her website tells you, has done stuff, a lot of stuff, and she's not kidding. An actress, dancer, choreographer, educator, Dazzle, and ASL master, she's performed all over the world with Deaf West's Broadway tour of Big River, and closer to home on Broadway in Central Park with a public theater, and even on the Super Bowl halftime show, 2017, the Eagles won, in case you don't remember. Her most recent triumph as the Lady in Purple in the public theater's acclaimed revival of Ntozake Shange's For Colored Girls Who Have Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough, last fall earned her a riveting feature in the New York Times. And for all that fame, Alexandria, like the rest of the folks with us today, is as humble as she is talented and inspiring. Last but hardly least, OTC's Director of Music Theater and Music Director for this project is Chrissie Astre, AKA our very own Music Man, and also our secret weapon. Chris has music directed literally dozens of shows at Only. His work on Cabaret last fall earned him his most recent Helen Hayes nomination. On his watch, OTC has risen to the top rank of DMV music theater producers, leading us to 2 Best Musical of the Year awards in the past 5 years. His long list of talents includes work at the Kennedy Center on Nobody's Perfect, the bilingual musical adaptation of Marlee Matlin's book about 2 fourth graders, one deaf and one hearing, and the friendship they form. Welcome all. Welcome also to Jennifer Vold and Lindsay Snyder from First Chair Interpreters. They've been with us since the project's inception. For our conversation today, those of you that are watching, feel free to type a question or comment on Facebook, and we'll do our best to fit it into the conversation. Before we begin, though, I'd like to show you a brief 3-minute video about the workshop we did with these amazing artists a year ago, and that's what convinced us this project would be something special. There were no costumes, just a piano, no band, and only 10 actors. And I'll say at this incredibly difficult, incredibly polarized time, as we mourn the deaths of not only 100,000 victims of COVID-19, but the victims of police brutality like George Floyd, community like what this show creates could not be more important. Let's watch the video.
I went to New York City to watch a show called Spring Awakening, and it was like a mixture of deaf and hearing actors. The cast was mixed. And I watched the show and I was like, yes, this is what we need, and we need it in the DC area.
I think our main focus for this stage is to really have a vision of the musical and see what is possible for a bilingual cast. And my sense of this as a workshop is a time to play, a time to learn, a time to keep what we like and reanalyze what needs more improvement.
The notion of hearing people and deaf people having actual empathy for each other and being able to start from not being able to communicate, but gradually they learn how to speak the same language.
We have deaf directors, we have deaf ASL, consultants, directors of artistic sign language, and deaf cast members. So I can just be an actor learning.
I think there is still a perception that ASL isn't singing and isn't actually speaking the text.
People think, oh, I can't hear it, so it doesn't really exist, and it's just something extra, or it's just gestures. And we're really swapping those values and putting ASL first and foremost. And it really is a new way of framing, the power of ASL as a language.
And with Rock Island, we found that there was a very interesting story happening where all the salesmen on the train were using only ASL, and that Harold actually is doing all of the dialogue for Rock Island.
Yes, sir. Who's gonna patronize a little bit 2x4 kind of store anymore? What do you talk? You get it? Not the Model T at all. Take a gander at the store, the modern store, at the present day store, at the present day modern departmentalized grocery store. What do you talk?
That voice becomes a metronome for the hearing audiences as a consistent rhythm in the background that then allows them to get used to looking at the signing and looking to the actor who is signing in any given moment. To really visually integrate the fact that they are seeing the visual words come to life in the ASL.
This is, one of the most special things that I've ever done.
Harold Hill is selling dreams, right?
Yeah.
We are selling that can be reality for the audience as well. Thank you for sharing this experience with us.
Awesome. Joey Caverly, why is this project so important?
Well, so as a person who is really deeply involved in theater, I've worked as an actor and a director since 2011. What I'm seeing is not just a lack of collaboration between deaf and hearing communities, but in terms of creating work. So when I saw the show Spring Awakening in 2016 on Broadway, it was incredible. For me, it was groundbreaking. It was a groundbreaking moment. It really shifted the ground for me that this is something that's possible. And I want to see many different theater companies to take the lead on this kind of thing, to see it, be inspired by it, and make similar productions of musicals of different kinds. But since that time, not enough has happened. And there are many talented actors out there that can indeed do the work. They can do the work, they do have the talent, they just need the opportunities. The DC area specifically, I can count on one hand how many plays have actually had deaf people included. And I'm really only familiar with one musical that has happened in DC with a deaf person. And that was Nobody's Perfect at the Kennedy Center. But that was a small cast show. A large cast musical, I have not seen. So for me, as a deaf person, I would like to see more representation on stage. I want to see the deaf community come into the theater and enjoy those artists on stage just as I do. And that's why I think this project is so important for me.
Michael, why aren't there opportunities, given that you have pioneered this work with Sandra Mae Frank in particular, not once but twice? Why did you feel that was so important to do for your audience in Oklahoma? And is your audience now expecting that there should be deaf people in every production?
There is an expectation that it's always possible. I have always done theater with my friends, and this all started when I didn't see the full production of Spring Awakening, but I knew it occurred. And I did see Deaf West's Big River years ago, because I'm a bit older. That was ASL integrated. But after seeing Spring Awakening, I said there has to be a way to work with deaf actors without being a deaf theater company. And I really didn't know how, except when I was a professor years ago at Holy Cross College. One of my students, who's now an adult, Chris Tester, is deaf, and he was in a production of Cyrano de Bergerac. And we've been friends throughout the years, and I called him up and we Zoomed and had a chat and said, hey, there has to be a way, one, to get you out here to do a show, and two, how might this work? And him and I decided that that summer I was doing Fiddler on the Roof, and that Perchik was a great character because he was an outsider and a teacher, so that kind of helped. And then he also said, I don't want to be the only deaf person in the show. So I think it makes sense that my girlfriend or a person in the show might also be deaf. So then I had auditions on video with Sandra and actually several members of the Spring Awakening cast. And instantly, I took to Sandra, particularly because her interpretation of the music, which I think is helpful for Music Man as well, was somehow she honored the period of Fiddler on the Roof. And she has a natural ability as an actress to have a modern sensibility, have a turn of the century shtetl Jewish sensibility, but everything she does is completely honest as an actor. And that always is the forefront of my mind. So with Sandra and Christopher, we figured out how this might work. And it was fast and furious, but pretty glorious. And I would still say it was the highlight of my career, and certainly the highlight of lyric theater since I've been there. Our audiences still talk about it constantly. Every time I'm in public, they mention Fiddler on the Roof. And so the quick answer to how did we do the next one, Sandra Mae Frank is a force to be reckoned with. And she realizes that directors like you and I very rarely have original ideas. And if actors come to us, it's a blessing with an idea. And Sandra said, hey, what are we doing next? And I told her the season, and in that season was Fun Home, which happened to be playing on Broadway opposite Spring Awakening. And she said, I would love to do Fun Home, and I would love to play Joan. And that was it. And I said, you've got it. So that we took several steps forward as well, though, in our relationship and how to integrate ASL. She was the only ASL actor in the cast, but in that production, we used super titles that reflected the graphic novel that musical was based on. So by having her in the show, it informed the scenery, the costumes, everything. Yeah. And when this project came up when Jason, you mentioned it to me, I said, oh, you have to meet Sandra Mae Frank. And he said, you have to meet Joey Caverly.
Awesome. Sandra, how talk to me about your work at Lyric, but also on Broadway with Spring Awakening. Did you feel that in both those cases, the productions and the hearing artists were able to let you just do your work as an artist and not make it about, oh, this is a deaf artist in a particular musical, but just let you be a musical theater actor?
Yes, absolutely. 6 years ago, if you would have asked me that I would be doing musical theater, I wouldn't have believed you. And then Spring Awakening happened. I was moving hither and thither, and everything happened very fast. And right after Spring Awakening was done, the run on Broadway, I auditioned for the Lyric. It wasn't a first time. I thought maybe it was a first time thing. I didn't know what I was going to do, and I auditioned, and then there I was involved in my second musical at the Lyric, and something really hit me about the music. I remember the first or second day focusing on the music, focusing on the singing. I thought, well, it's boring for me. Maybe I'll go out in the hallway and practice my sign language. And director said, no, why don't you stay and watch it? And I was looking at the sheet music in particular as they were singing, and I was watching them and looking at the music. So typically I'm looking at the lyrics. I'm not looking at the sheet music. So that day I am reading along with the music, and I remember the specific line, sunrise, sunset, and I could see that meaning in the music sheet. So thinking about how I could change my sign to adapt that. So they asked if I could see how I was signing it. So I worked with them, and I found a way to match that with the music. Now I don't hear, but I'm thinking about visually how I am matching that with the sound. But me as a deaf person, how I am impacted and trying to find it in that particular moment, I just really had an impactful moment and fell in more love. And so more and more, I'm thinking about developing and working on that music, and thinking about, no, it's not just about having a deaf person and a hearing person and having to educate each other about what's happening. We are as one, where we can follow each other, we can do more. It's not about educating. Educating is great, education's important, but as an artist, I want to work with someone to create something, and I want us to push ourselves even more as we continue with the work.
That's awesome. There's a comment from Rita Tehan, pardon me if I mispronounce your name. One of the best shows I've ever seen was Deaf West Theater's production of Big River at Ford's Theater in 2005. It was phenomenal. That is part of what Alexandria toured all over the world. Japan, there's a great story about her interpreting in Japanese, ASL, and English during a fire alarm, I believe, on her website. Alexandria, since you've been part of this,
it was an earthquake, Jason. It was an earthquake.
Earthquake. Thank you. Sorry. Since even harder, since you've been part of this, since really deaf hearing musicals have risen to prominence, how have deaf hearing musicals changed in your opinion? And what are the next steps that you think the field needs to take and we need to take on the Music Men?
Oh, all of those questions are from me? Okay, great. All right. You're going to have to remind me of all three parts. So yes, fortunately, my journey has a lot of productions that have been integrated with hearing and deaf people, like Deaf West. And what I'm noticing is the commonality of what is beautiful and wonderful are these bonds and these friendships between the people who really find these ties as we are creating. We're finding allies, we're learning together, just as Sandra mentioned about the teaching aspect. But when you're working with people who already get it, it makes a huge difference, and you can go deeper into the material to really focus more on the minutia. You can really, as you go on, as more people get involved, your investment becomes deeper and more profound. So what was the second? There was a second and third one, but I lost the second question.
How, between Big River and Spring Awakening and what we're thinking of for Music Man, how has this discipline changed?
So social media has been a big influence. So I was in 3 productions of Big River, 2002, 3. So in that time period. So 3 different productions. And at that time, social media was non-existent. So we were relying on word of mouth as we toured. When it came to Spring Awakening, there were more people who could connect to the actors, connect to the artists, talk about what was happening, provide support and encouragement. So I've noticed a real wave of more people from the deaf population getting involved and socializing with artists. And so this tide is really sailing. So now with the Music Man, I think it's a really interesting time in the coronavirus or post-coronavirus period. So what that means is the $64,000 question, because we have a lot of people who are knowledgeable, who are part of the world in this unique approach to theater making, and bringing them together for music and signing and movement, choreography, singing, acting, and with these languages dancing together. It's really a fabulous alchemy of all of these ingredients. And so we want people to feel fascinated and excited and a little nervous about it. But we really are pushing the boundaries and as we build this together. And so we're offering a lot to our audience and our artists, and we want everyone to feel involved and to be excited about moving forward.
Great. Chris, speaking of pushing boundaries, you've been talking about, what was the first show that you did at Olney, that you music directed at Olney?
Oh, Bye Bye Birdie, I think.
Bye Bye Birdie in the old historic theater.
Yeah.
So when you think about the trajectory from that to Cabaret last fall, you've been wanting to really reimagine musicals. You were really struck by the recent Broadway revival of Oklahoma, how that show reimagined that classic musical for contemporary audience. Why is this so important for us to do at Olney and for audience members anyhow?
Well, I just think, it's, any theater can take, it's difficult to do musicals, but any theater can take Music Man and just do a great production of it, just going with the page, casting traditionally, casting who's in what role and everything like that. But the move is now to try and make these beautiful shows, written in the 40s, 50s, 60s, like, with Oklahoma and Spring Awakening more recently, and try to make them not only available to other audiences, but to other actors. It's not... The more actors and the more people of various talents that you can put in a show, the better the show, the better experience, and the better the community. And he gives you the chance to really come up with something special. So you have just Music Man, and it's a beautiful show, and we could do it really great. But to do it where it has a new sense of community with it, where we have half the actors are hearing and half of them are deaf. And what does that say in a musical that's about music? And so, it's also one of those things that when you first learn how to do musicals and everything, you learn what the rules are, and this is how you do it. And so you learn that Harold Hill should be this person and Marion Peru should be this person. And that's how it should work out. And you're going to have a great show. And that's the recipe. It's like reading the back of the box top. And the older you get and more experience, the more you're like, not only you want like getting a little itchy because like, for example, this will be the 4th time that I've done Music Man, but to just come up with something fresh and use a new pool of artists that are not normally used. When I did Nobody's Perfect at Candy Cellar with Alexandria, it was like it was a whole new group of artists that I worked with, and then when the show was over, they were gone, and it was and so I've been really excited as soon as Joey came up to us and said, "Oh my gosh, we could revisit that." And then when Joey mentioned someone named Alexandria, I'm like, I remember that name, Alexandria, and then remember, oh my gosh, I worked with her, and so the ability to work with new artists with different perspectives, things that are gonna punch me out of my comfort zone. This show is just gonna totally take me by the legs, turn me upside down, and shake me because I can't bring a bunch of, these are the rules of Music Man. You all follow this beat and you do this. We can't do that. I need to learn the rules of other communities, and I need to be the one to adapt and say, all right, how can we put this together so that both hearing and deaf audiences can feel and hear the music the same way, or in different ways, but to the same level of fulfillment. And so that's what's really exciting to me about it.
That's great. That everybody, all of us, are learning a whole new language, if you will, not just ASL, but a new language about the Music Man. So before we get into, Bruce Alpert has posted a great question about what do those of us in the audience need to think about when we see a musical with deaf actors, and also I want to just ask generally for those who haven't seen a musical with deaf and hearing actors, what does that mean? Before we answer that question, Joey, why did you pick The Music Man of all possible musicals to suggest?
Why I picked The Music Man? So, since this play is an adaptation, so when I saw Spring Awakening, a play about teenage angst, anger, sex, and parents who are or are not exposing their children to the birds and the bees. And as a result, they're facing issues like pregnancy, anger, and all of that. So these are those specific issues. So when applying a deaf filter, it makes sense to that musical if the parents cannot communicate clearly what the birds and the bees are about. So applying that filter makes sense without really removing anything from the integrity of the play itself. So when I'm thinking about various plays and thinking about what play would fit perfectly for that deaf filter to be applied, that deaf perspective, considering our world and how we function, what play would be a perfect fit for that? And I thought about The Music Man and how it would be a fit as Harold Hill comes into a town with a variety of deaf people, and he's going to teach them how to play musical instruments. The beautiful thing is that Harold Hill does not teach them about how to hear music. He teaches them how to play music and their instruments. And that really is a very exciting thing. So growing up, I learned how to play the guitar. I went and took lessons to play the guitar, and I was terrible at it. I quit after a couple of weeks. But the point is that for that short period of time, and in that moment, I was excited about it. It was new. So if someone else came up to me or came up to any deaf young child and said, hey, I am going to teach you how to play a musical instrument, It's not about being oppressive. It's not about saying you couldn't possibly do music. Someone says, yes, I'm going to teach you music. That's going to instill a lot of excitement. So that idea of putting on that from a deaf perspective is really exciting. It fits perfectly. So finding a true ally for the deaf community.
That's great. I know we also talked about early on, we talked about historically deaf communities like Martha's Vineyard, and the idea that maybe in sort of fashioning the world that Michael and Alexandria started working on as directors, creating a world where River City had deaf residents and hearing residents, and they had figured out how to communicate with each other. It's this outsider, Harold Hill, who has no real way of communicating, and it's not until he meets Marion that he learns that through the language of love how to open his heart and communicate better. And I think it makes to me, as I was watching the workshop, the story is even stronger than for me as a hearing person who has just seen a traditional version. So to Bruce's question, for a hearing audience, or I should say maybe a traditional audience who has never seen Spring Awakening on Broadway or any musical with deaf and hearing actors, how is it gonna feel different? Let me ask Alexandria first, and then maybe on to Michael.
I think Joey really gave a really perfect explanation that when you're approaching a script, you're thinking about what themes are coming up within that particular narrative. Mentioning the idea of belief. For me, the Music Man is really about the power of belief in yourself, whether it's legitimate or not. But the idea of that faith and confidence is really something that's amazing, because once it's there, you can't take it away. So for people who haven't experienced this kind of different approach, they have to think about the themes that are incorporated into that story. Like in Spring Awakening, with the teen angst, being misunderstood, questioning authority, generational misunderstandings, these are common issues. So thinking about that deaf filter of the deaf experience, really finding that buried and baked in theme and idea that can be exposed to an audience. And we want the audience to really absorb all of those ideas through the excitement of a full theater production. And I think you have to give yourselves time and patience with yourself. And really, you will need a few minutes to adjust to maybe this new way. But once you let go of the stress of something new, I think that the experience may start overwhelming, but it will be new. It will tie things together perfectly. It will be a new mix of things, but I believe that what we're trying to do and what we will achieve is truly organized chaos. And it will unify beautifully. I think how we approach the material, there will be a deeper understanding, a mutual understanding, not just about two different communities, but really thinking about the language of love and the language of belief in yourself, and how that's passed on generationally and relationships. So we want to leave that space thinking that we are varied but together. So we're celebrating our commonalities and our differences. And I want to thank Joey for introducing me to the Olney Theater for this project. So I know he's been sort of reminding me, and he was at me for a while. So I thank you heartily.
Nice. I think, Alexandria, what you said in that video was something so striking to me as a hearing audience member, how you crafted Rock Island and it became a metronome. The vocals became a metronome whereby I was able, as a hearing audience, to assimilate into understanding the ASL and the importance of ASL to how I was going to see the show. Michael, can you talk about can you just, if you want to add on, how do hearing audiences, what's going to be different for hearing audiences, and how quickly are they going to be like, oh yeah, that's just mechanics and I'm fully in the story?
Well, I mean, I do think that the Music Man is an evolution, at least for me, on storytelling, and that both with Fiddler on the Roof and Fun Home, I did not tell the audience, I think with Fiddler, that there were deaf actors in the show. I think with Fun Home, it might have been mentioned that Sandra was coming back, but with Fiddler, right before the show started, in my curtain speech, I said, listen, we have some very talented actors that happen to be deaf, and we're going to do Fiddler on the Roof. Enjoy. And it takes it's sort of like watching a foreign film a little bit. And some people don't like foreign films. They're like, I can't stand reading while watching a movie. And I love it because I feel I'm getting two worlds at once. And with Fiddler on the Roof, what happened was that because Sandra and Christopher are deaf in real life and are deaf actors, it informed the relationship between Tevye and his daughters, how the daughters reacted to each other, how certain lines in the musical all of a sudden resonated. I will say, though, the show wasn't necessarily better than another version. It just was our version, and it was very moving. What I hope in this production we don't have, which I did have in Fiddler, and we did have in Big River, is a moment where there was no singing or talking and everyone just did sign language, which is a very cathartic moment for hearing audiences. But if you're deaf, that's how you live in the world. And so I don't know if that moment for the hearing audience is necessary anymore to give them a catharsis that, oh, this is what it must be like to not hear. Like, just stop talking and then you'll know, and then try to communicate. With Fun Home, I think that most of the audience did not know that the part was not written for a deaf actor. They actually thought that the part was a deaf character, and that Sandra was playing the deaf character. We got questions of, is she really deaf? And was the character written for a deaf actor? And but that question was rarely asked, and people just accepted that this is what Fun Home was about, with these actors playing it. Whenever you get a group of people together, actors and artists, it's going to be their version, and that was our version. The thing about the Music Man, which I think is very special, is that I as well have done the show like Chris before, and that this is not about nostalgia. And usually the Music Man is about recreating or getting the feeling of what it was like during Meredith Willson's time in Iowa, which is absolutely valid. But in this production, since we've seen that before so many times, Alexandria and I said, can we not have any old-fashioned type costumes? Can we not have any lattice work? Can there not be, the porch as we know it? And can we really talk about how this is about communication in the many ways, the honest communication between hearing people and deaf people? Sometimes there's lip reading involved. Sometimes there's not at all. Sometimes there's an interpreter. Sometimes a deaf person can vocalize and chooses to. Sometimes they don't. So there is a much more complex world of communicating that I think the Music Man, this production, will address. I will say one of the most amazing things in my life moment where I was like, wow, I take a lot of things for granted. Alexandra and our set designer, Ethan, who is a professor at Gallaudet, he is deaf as well. They were talking about our scenic idea. And essentially it was a bare stage. And naturally, I always think of a bare stage as a square. And that's a town square, and that's how things happen. And they were talking about circles and swirls. And I really was like, what are you talking about? And Alexandria said, oh, yeah, deaf people hate the way cities are designed. They're designed for people that can hear. And we're constantly bumping into each things. There are corners we have to talk to each other, facing each other. And from that moment, I said, oh, of course we should think about circles, ramps, what would be, Alexandra, I don't know if you want to share more about that conversation, but I realized that the very nature of how cities are designed is I'm already, as a hearing person, have the advantage without even knowing it.
I think everything about this production is challenging our assumptions in wonderful and exciting ways. And by the way, so many great comments are popping up here. I want to thank Mandy for her question about, is this production going to involve added light cues for deaf performers and so on? And of course, there's going to be a great deal, just like considering how set design is going to function in a way. There's going to be a lot that is going to have to be that we're all going to relearn and do differently. One of the things that is going to help us question our our assumptions has to do with the rest of the casting, not just between deaf and hearing actors, but people of all ethnicities. I forget who it was. Somebody also mentioned, Marty Converse mentioned making sure that this is going to be a multi-ethnic production indeed. And I was thinking that wonderful moment when Sandra as Marion is teaching Monique Holt as Amaryllis how to play the piano. Sandra, how was that to work on? I imagine that Joey has learned to play the guitar, but I'm guessing you don't know how to play the piano or never learned. So what was that about? And then I'm going to ask Chris then how he taught about that moment, because I know it was revelatory for him.
Yeah, so that scene was actually pretty funny because in elementary school, I did take music classes and I was always that deaf kid that was like, oh, you think I can't do this? Watch me. So I was always that kid in music class. So I really did have a sense of like, I'm going to do this. And my music teachers were almost all hearing. And then they changed their piano keys to visual cues because I couldn't hear the differences between all the keys. I don't know even the right words to use when I talk about piano keys. I'll go look that up. But for that scene, it was just amazing to show what it was like to show like once a deaf person does this, it's like, oh, there are deaf people out there that play guitar, that play drums, other instruments, and are very good at it. So why would one think that only hearing people can teach deaf people how to play an instrument? I mean, usually if you have a similar experience, then you would be, as your student, you'd be more able to teach them effectively. So as a deaf teacher, you'd be more effective at teaching a deaf student. So I think it goes beyond just thinking, oh, deaf people can't do this and they actually can. It's like you really think twice about what deaf people can do. So I think there's a lot more to it. I thought it was really amazing when you guys were talking about this and saying like, why not have my character teach Monique's character? Yes.
I will say when we did Fun Home with Sandra, she, in Raincoat of Love, the dance number, by far was the best dancer, was by far the one that kept a beat, by far was the one that interpreted it the best with the music. So don't doubt her ability ever.
Yeah. Chris, Alexandria.
I just think that I think that musicality is something that people often forget is a very important part of your sort of embodied experience. People will think, oh, well, because I don't have auditory access, I have no rhythm, or I can hear, therefore I do have rhythm. And it's like, no, I know plenty of hearing people who just don't. Bless them who don't have rhythm. It's fine. We're all humans. It's just part of, just like some deaf people have it, some don't. So I think that this really creates a real opportunity that when you provide this, it's just a natural thing. And I know a lot of people are astounded when it's not something that they would have expected. But yes, there are artists who are deaf who have this amazing musicality that's just so deeply a part of who they are. And I think it's something wonderful, not just to be watched, but celebrated. So I think it's something that we do want to investigate more in our production with a deaf instructor or a deaf student, because, like Sandra just said, a deaf person is able to communicate in a way that's more intimate with another deaf person, a way that is less prone to miscommunication, because you're just more able to communicate across a shared experience, or at least a shared worldview or perspective. So I think those a sort of delightful moment, and that's just one of many that are certain to come in this production as we explore and consider how we remind people that just because something is not their experience, it does not mean that that experience does not exist. It does in my world. I grew up dancing. I grew up, very visual and interacting with people in various ways. I have been a part and experience of diversity and diverse experiences my whole life. Just because it doesn't happen on stage, that's fine. But when it is on stage, it's like, well, welcome to my world. That feels normal to me.
We did a retreat a few months ago. Oh, sorry, Sandra, did you have your hand raised?
I did, but no, I just wanted to add to that about how theater brings people together from, various classes or learning or whatever. So Monique Holt was actually my first drama teacher. She is the reason that I am here. She is the one who convinced me to major in theater. She gave me an internship with Joey, actually. So, talk about things coming full circle. And then I worked with Alexandria on Spring Awakening. So our paths are crossing, but each time we end up pushing ourselves farther to advance more. So, and I think part of this has become because of the fact that we understand each other so well. And so I just wanted to share that Monique was one of my first teachers. And I just think it's amazing to be working with her on this project.
That's awesome. Full circle. Alexandria, tell us a little bit more about the casting that you and Michael and Chris have sort of decided on, in terms of, just to help for those who know Music Man, who do you think is going to be played by a deaf performer? Who's going to be played by a hearing performer, and so on? And then I'm going to ask Chris also.
So, Michael, please do feel free to jump in, because the two of us are very much working together as co-directors to make these sorts of decisions. So without going too much into the specifics, we generally looked at the units. So, for example, if Miss Peru, like if her mother is hearing and her daughter is, then we want her daughter to be deaf. And then the younger brother could be deaf or maybe hearing. But in that unit, we thought about what are their languages of communication. Like the mom learned how to sign later in life. She didn't know sign before she ended up having deaf children. So that means that her sign language fluency would look different than someone who's a lifelong signer, someone who uses ASL as a social language. Siblings then, like a younger sibling, even if they're hearing of a deaf sibling, would have a different level of fluency than their own parent. So that's how we looked at the dynamics and tried then to carry that through the whole play. Harold Hill is hearing, and his buddy, Marcellus, is deaf, and they're both salesmen. So they both have shared knowledge about how to like hoodwink people and how to convince people of things. So that, then means that there's a person who can be sort of a chameleon, and that both of these are people who can make those sort of adjustments, who can speak when they want or sign when they want or whatever. They just look at their whole lives as a tool, and how do you use their different tools in different spaces. So it makes sense that these two buddies get away with a whole lot. And we looked at how language is used within those dynamics of each of those units. So, it definitely took a while to figure all of that out. So it's like, if there's two people who are deaf who are interacting, who are then speaking for them. And so, how do we also bring to it a small town feel without like bringing on two interpreters that are just these two random people and are going to be at the front of the stage and be very removed from everything else that's happening, and then have this sort of isolated interpretive role. I think that would be too jarring. It's like, hey, stranger. So we really wanted to build it into the story, into the relationships, into that small town, because in small towns people know a lot about each other, and so that's a great gateway as a point of entry for how we could make sure that everyone is in the know of what's going on. Michael, feel free to add to that if you want.
Yeah, so we did a workshop with actors, and then the creative team came together when was that? I guess this spring, to actually figure out this puzzle, because, and you have to do it, I guess, with any show nowadays, because, you know, the Music Man probably originally had 48 people in it or something ridiculous. And we're doing the show, I think at 100. I think we're doing it with 16 is the thought, of 8 hearing and 8 deaf. And so that already was a challenge, just to figure out who's doubling the town. And then, as Alexandria said, as you went through the actual married couples in town, it was interesting to see, oh, this married couple is actually 2 deaf people. This one's a hearing and a deaf person. Who the mayor is, how the doubling works. It's just a really big puzzle. And to Chris's point, how do we cover all of the singing and musical parts when you have barbershop quartets and Pick a Little Ladies? And I would tell you and get into the nitty gritty of how that all happens, but I assure you, it is covered. There is a question, I don't know, because I do realize, Jason, that we made some decisions that Joey and Sandra might not be aware of.
I know. I was just thinking that. I was like, do we want to reveal some casting for Joey? No, we don't want to tell Joey yet, not in public. But the Winthrop question is a good one that Hillary Ann Kotler has asked. That's all I'm going to say. We'll talk later. But anyway, Chris, tell us without getting into too much nitty gritty, you've been really puzzling about the quartet and the Pick a Little Ladies. I mean, we are, tell us about that.
Yeah, so there's two elements with the show where I'm, I have to like recognize that I have biases of conventional theater. I have these biases in my head. And there's two things, Music Man, as Michael mentioned, there's a huge cast, and when they come to Iowa City and they're all on stage singing full gusto. And it was one of the things that, the recent Oklahoma, which is one of the reasons I deliberately went to see it, because that was part of the thing. How did they do this big village when that Oklahoma production also was a really small thing? And I think they had mixed success with that. And so the question not only comes, what to do with the full ensemble when you have 16 actors, only 8 of which can vocalize music. And then the other thing is, then of those 8, you're supposed to have the barbershop quartet. If you don't know Music Man, the barbershop quartet is this theatrical device for this show. The barbershop music in the show is all extractable. None of it has to do with the plot whatsoever. The actual device, though, is that it's these 4 men that bicker who are trying to catch Harold Hill, and he distracts them by taking these 4 bickering men and making them this cohesive unit of singing in 4-part harmony. And the way that barbershop quartet sounds is not only that it's 4 parts, but that you hear a 5th overtone with the reinforced male voices. And so how do you do that? And so I had lots of conversations with Alexandria and Michael and Jason and others, like, how do we do this? Do we, do I get out of my biases and say, no, it's not going to be a barbershop quartet. It's only going to be 2 people who sing, and we'll make it work. For the workshop, we actually made Mrs. Peru one of the members of the quartet, and it was kind of funny. It sort of kind of worked. And so that, we're still kind of exploring that. We might be looking at like members of the band to fill in, because the one thing I didn't want, if we're talking about building community, if we're building the community of a barbershop quartet and they all hear, that to me, we've defeated our purpose right there in one moment. So we're going to find a way. We're still exploring some options where we'll have the quartet singing and signing it to various levels. And then we might add voices for the band. And if it goes only to 3 voices at one point, so be it, So those are the kind of ways we're trying to press on the corners or pull the corners of the bed sheet to make these 16 actors work with this storytelling and still get to the point of what was trying to happen with that barbershop music.
Yeah. I think that's what I continue to love about this process that we have all been through, and everything we've learned is that the form of the process, which is people from different places in the world come together to create a community that's not what you would expect, is what happens in the play. In that instance, they're bickering and they are in great disagreement all the time. And then the power of music, and remember, it's not the power of traditionally beautiful music, it's the power of this kids band that is very bad, in terms of traditional music comes together in a way that creates community. We only have time for a couple more questions. Oh no, I see that we've had Ethan Sinnott's been watching, and Steve Fan and Mindy Laney, all kinds of wonderful folks. And I want to ask two more questions. One, I think Alexandria, especially because of your dance background. We have Karma Camp, who is a well-known choreographer in town, and Michelle Banks, who is our Director of American Sign Language. How are you hoping the two of them work together?
So both of them are amazing artists to start. So from my experience working on Spring Awakening as associate choreographer, I've realized how important it is to have the choreographer and the dazzle work together in a way that's truly infused, so that everything is just abundantly clear to the entire audience. So when there's a dance, it's physical movement. When there is ASL happening, it's communication movement. And you need to combine the two. So in spaces where we can generate a full environment that's visually informative, then the music turns into what people hear visually. So I think that the two of them working together is going to lead us to a lot of discoveries, and I look forward to it. So I'll be there to support their process and help out wherever I can. So I think it really just comes down to true teamwork, a spirit of collaboration, playfulness, creativity. And I think that's the fantasticness of discovery during the workshop, is to get to see all of that, just to see this openness, to get to see how things go if we move things around, like what we were doing with the train, and how everyone got that sense of the movement of the train with physicality and with ASL, keeping that tempo of how a train moves. And yeah, exactly, Sandra Mae. Sandy, it was sort of like patting your head and rubbing your tummy or whatever. So how do you do that in a way that is visually interesting but not nauseating? So I have complete confidence in both Karma and Michelle, and I absolutely look forward to working with both of them.
Great. One last question back to Joey. A few years ago, you came up with this idea, and since then, we've had a week-long workshop, and now we've announced the production. How is it developing the way you envisioned it, or is it developing in a different way?
So it does not align with my original vision. No, when I first presented the idea, I mean, it was sort of loosely formed. It was certainly able to be called an idea. And then when Alexandria and Michael came on, they took that very sort of nebulous idea and made it better. I don't know. I mean, you have to understand that, like, when it comes to creatives working together, deaf people and hearing people really working in tandem, often we see that, we see the work of deaf actors, we see that it works, but we also often see that, like, something was clearly designed with the hearing audience in mind primarily. It's really clear. And so I think I may have even had that mentality, as, like I probably took on that hearing perspective. But once I saw what Alexandria did, who has years of experience and just a wealth of experience, she was really able to transform that into something different, into something fresh, into something that I definitely loved and was like, please, yes, take this, run with it, do your thing. So yeah, so I think it's a really beautiful thing to see so many deaf artists working together collaboratively and to have deaf leadership like we have in Alexandria on this project. I feel that by doing that, it will be equally enjoyable for deaf and hearing audiences. And Alexandria saying, no pressure. Thanks, Joey. He's saying, you got it. Alexandria, no, that was beautiful. Thank you so much. And thank you for having such confidence and faith in us. We will see what happens.
We will indeed. And I know what we see is going to be really spectacular. just from the 1 week of work that we did, by the end of the week, when, you know, you all had hardly time to get to know the words, remember everybody was in tears and understood the play better than they ever had before, hearing or deaf. So I know that's going to happen. I want to thank everybody in the community who watched this and will watch this going forward. Please check out more about Only Theater Center. Come back, like one fantastic commenter said, she just moved to Michigan, but she's coming back to Maryland to see the show. Do the same. It'll be next spring. I want to thank our amazing panelists. I want to thank our fantastic interpreters. Please join us next week if you want to learn about how directors are seeing light after the crisis. We've got Broadway director Stephen Brackett, Miss You Like Hell director Lisa Cortez, Ann Kaufman, one of Off-Broadway's most amazing directors, and Aaron Posner, one of the DMV's star directors, all in conversation with Peter Marks. That's next Saturday at 5 p.m. And now, again, all, thank you so much. Have a great night.